making the sour cream chocolate cake, and I have all the ingredients measured out here for a half sheet pan of the chocolate cake. So this is a half recipe of what is printed online. All you need are the ingredients, a sheet pan, an offset spatula, a piece of parchment paper, and your stand mixer. The first item we're going to put together are the butter and the brown sugar. We're going to cream them together. So I'm placing the softened butter and all of our brown sugar into the mixer, lifting the bowl and mixing it about on speed 2. We want this to come together and look smooth and creamy. Because of the large amount of brown sugar compared to the butter, it probably will look slightly on the drier side, but not to worry because we're going to be adding more liquid later. So after mixing this mixture for about 3 minutes, this is what you get. It looks kind of compacted. Just a moistened brown sugar. It's really not full of a lot of fat at this point. So this is what it should look like. The next item I'm going to be adding are eggs and our vanilla. I'm mixing those 2 items together and then pouring them into our mixture. Let the paddle do the work to incorporate the eggs fully before we add the chocolate, and I will help the machine by stopping it and scraping it down. Do this periodically until you have a really smooth consistency of a batter. When you do scrape the sides, make sure you get to the very bottom. That's the most important part, so that you don't have any lumps left into your batter. It kind of looks like a caramel color. It's really beautiful and it's very smooth. We don't want any lumps of the brown sugar. The next item I'm going to add is my melted but cooled unsweetened chocolate. And the reason why I'm using the unsweetened chocolate instead of regular chocolate is so I can control the amount of sugar. You've noticed there's quite a bit of brown sugar in here, but I want the intensity of the chocolate flavor. Therefore, we utilize the unsweetened chocolate so it's not diluted with extra sugar. Now, in a pinch, you can use regular chocolate, but you will definitely get a different flavor profile. So I want to make sure I get all that chocolate off my spatula. And I'm going to turn this on and mix it until it's smooth again. Now don't forget to scrape down the sides of your bowl consistently and constantly. And I have the last 2 items that we're going to mix into our batter here. And what it is flour and our baking soda, as well as a pinch of salt. And this I'm just going to sift to make sure that I don't have any lumps. Put it into another bowl. And then I'm going to add this. If you have any lumps, just push that through. I'm going to be adding this alternately with the liquid mixture, which will become my sour cream here, as well as my warm water. So I just mix those 2 items together, whisk those until that is smooth, and then we have the remaining part of our batter that needs to go into the mixer. I'm going to alternate these in the mixer with adding the dry first, the wet, the dry, the wet, and the remaining dry. So 3 parts dry, 2 parts wet, alternating those at this time. Never put the mixer on higher than about speed 2. So again, be patient, take your time adding, no more than speed 2. I'm gonna add about 1/3 of my dry mixture, letting that incorporate, and feel free to stop the mixer and scrape down as needed. So we'll help that flour along the edge a little bit. Because I'm dealing with such a small amount. If I were making a full batch, then it would catch it a little bit easier. So I'll turn that back on, and then we're going to alternate adding our liquid ingredients after the flour has been incorporated. because you will start to develop more gluten, but as soon as you see that dark chocolate mixture, I'm gonna add half of my liquid and let that incorporate. Again, stopping the machine, helping it along, turning it back on, and then once that mixture looks smooth and incorporated, I'm gonna repeat those steps, adding more flour, then more liquid, and then the rest of the flour. So I'm incorporating the very last amount of the flour, and the reason why we alternate the flour and the liquid is to maintain the proper texture of the batter throughout the mixing process, so it won't get too thick or too liquidy, and it really works out much better that way. So once this dry mixture is completely incorporated, again, we do not want to overmix it to encourage gluten development because we want this cake to be nice and tender. Then we're going to take this off and just mix it by hand so that we know we have all of the dry mixture incorporated, and we'll spread this onto a prepared sheet pan. So I removed the bowl from the mixer, took off the paddle, and just going to kind of clean that off so we get all the batter we possibly can. And I'm going to scrape the sides to make sure all this dry mixture is incorporated as well. So a good rubber spatula will come in very handy. Make sure you really get to the bottom. Everything should be very nicely incorporated. Your batter should look extremely chocolatey, smooth, and slightly fluffy. We did not incorporate too much air into it because we kept it at a very low speed. So now what I'm going to do is take my sheet pan covered with parchment paper, and I'm going to pour the batter over the entire thing. The more I pour in like a line here, the less I have to work at trying to spread this out evenly. So I want to make sure I distribute that from side to side and really scrape as much batter as you possibly can using the sides of the rubber spatula. All right. Then the most important part is using an offset spatula, holding it with your finger extended and spreading it side to side. Then I'm turning the pan, so I'm never turning my body. I'm always turning the pan, gluing it down, touching the sides so that the paper doesn't crumple underneath. You don't want it to buckle, and then I turn it again. So make sure you have enough space to be able to do that. This is a fairly thin cake. We will be making layers with this, so spread it nice and evenly all the way across. We don't want hills and valleys. And then one time through the center. Give a little scrape of that. We want all that good stuff on there. Make it even. Give it one good tap. And then this is ready to go into the oven. Because it's such a thin cake, we're gonna bake this really hot, so at 400 for about 5 to 8 minutes. Everyone's oven's gonna be slightly different, so what you're testing it for is for feel. You're gonna touch the top and it should be slightly springy back. If it's really wet, it's obviously not done, so leave it a couple more minutes. The next step of making the chocolate mousse cake is our chocolate praline paste feuilletine mixture. The feuilletine are these cookie crumbs. They're delicious. They taste like waffle cone and adds a really nice crunch and texture to the cake. So what we want here is a silicone mat lined sheet pan. You can use parchment, but I think it comes up so much easier if you happen to have a silicone mat. I'm going to melt the milk chocolate. I have my praline paste here and my feuilletine. Once the chocolate's melted, we just put everything together in here, stir it all up, spread it onto the sheet, and I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Now my chocolate's melted, and the best way to melt this, honestly, is just in the microwave, 30 seconds at a time, stirring it constantly when you take it out. And this took me about 1 minute and 20 seconds. I do not want this burning hot. I just want it warm so that all of the chocolate is fully melted. So now we're going to add this directly into the feuilletine mixture. along with our praline paste, and just stir this up. Make sure that you do measure your ingredients. What I've given you might be slightly more, so make sure you do measure it out by weighing it. So we want to incorporate this so that all of that cookie crumble is saturated with the chocolate and the praline paste. And then we're going to spread this on, like I said, the silicone mat and with a offset spatula. So we'll move this over here, this in view so you can see it. Place it right on here. Now, how thick to make it? That's completely up to you. Keep in mind that when this is chilled, it is a little bit difficult to cut through, so you don't want it to be like 1/4 inch thick. Again, using my finger on the metal part to really push down and spread this out back and forth using the edges, but in a very quick way. We do not want holes in between. We want this to be a solid mass. It does not have to take up the whole size of the sheet pan. I will eventually be placing our cake into this about 9-inch ring. You can use a 6-inch, an 8-inch. If you don't have a ring, you can just do freeform. But the cake will make, since we baked a full-size cake, it will make about half the size of a layered cake. So whatever you decide to put it in, we need at least that amount of surface to be able to fill the bottom. So we're gonna cut this out later on. So I know I need to make it a little bigger. And whatever extra there is, you can always remelt this down and reform it over and over again, and keeping it in the refrigerator, it stays crunchy. It's a really awesome combination. Adds a lot of flavor and texture. So I've spread this out so that I know for sure I can fill the bottom of the ring when I'm ready to assemble later on. This is gonna be the bottom layer. But just in case you feel like you're not getting it smooth enough, another way to do this is remove this from the sheet pan, place it on a flat surface. And if you happen to have another silicone mat, you can put it right on top and with a rolling pin, really compact that down. So you know that it's going to be solid mass that has no holes in it. And you can get it a little bit thinner this way if that's your intention. So if you're doing almost like little individual mousse cakes instead of a large one, you can do this as well. You obviously don't want to pull it off now because it will stick. But once it goes in the refrigerator and it chills, that chocolate will harden and you'll see it will pull right off. And then we have a certain amount of time that we can cut it before it starts to get warm again. So you can keep refrigerating it to firm it up. I'll show you that in a little bit. We'll place this right back onto our sheet pan and throw that into the refrigerator, probably for a good 20 minutes. Feuilletine chocolate hazelnut mixture is cold now, and the best way to get this out is to peel off the top layer and then place it back on, and then on a flat surface out of the sheet pan, we're going to flip it over very quickly and then peel the bottom. So now it's fully removed from here. Be careful because it is fragile. We're going to let this sit for a couple minutes until it softens up, because if I try and cut this right away, it's just going to crack on me. And I wanted to maintain a perfectly round disc that does not have any cracks. So if I just let it soften slightly, then I will take my ring and press it in. Now you can do individual ones too, so if you happen to have individual small rings, you can do that, or you can even assemble this in PVC pipe, but you'll have to use a cookie cutter to be able to do to cut it, because the PVC won't cut through this very well. So this has been sitting for a few minutes, and I'm gonna take my ring and place it right in the center. Pressing down, you can hear it crunch through. Making sure that it fully cuts all the way through. Obviously it's not sharp enough to cut the silicone mat, so that's fine. And then all the excess here I can just remove and place into a small container in order to use it later on. It really does melt down really well later on, so you can see how soft it gets from just sitting out at room temperature. Remember, this chocolate is not tempered, so it will not harden up and stay hard at room temperature. That's why we need to refrigerate it to assemble it. And because this is a mousse cake, it will be stored in the refrigerator the whole time anyway, due to the contents of it having dairy in it. So I do not have to worry about sitting out at room temperature and having to move it. So what I'm going to do now is transfer this to a sheet pan. Very carefully. And this will get stored, and then we will assemble. I can let it harden up again in the refrigerator and move it to a clean one if I want, or just start assembling in here with our mousse and our cake. As we make our chocolate mousse for our chocolate mousse cake, I have melted my dark chocolate here. The best way to do that for me is in the microwave, 30 seconds at a time. Keep stirring it every time, and you get a really nice even melt. You can definitely do this over a bain-marie, but I just find this easier. So you want to take your coffee, which has been measured out here, and we want to mix that together with that melted chocolate. You can also melt this together with it at the same time in the microwave or over the bain-marie. Doesn't really matter. So I'm going to actually transfer this into a larger bowl. And then you're going to check to make sure it's not hot. It should be about 95 degrees or so, and it'll just feel slightly warm. We're going to add our butter to it. But before we do that, we want to make sure we have all the parts of our mousse prepared and ready to go. And so that includes getting our meringue ready as well as our whipped cream. So you'll see it'll have a hard time incorporating it first, but then it will get very smooth. And that's because of the water with the chocolate, the fat in the chocolate. But now we have an emulsification happening, and it looks really shiny and smooth, and that's what we're looking for. So we want to kind of keep that slightly warm in order to then add our very softened butter. This should be room temperature so that when it goes into here, it will go ahead and melt just slightly. Before I add my eggs and my butter to my chocolate, I want to make sure that I have my cream ready as well, and I'm going to keep that refrigerated. So I've mixed the cream, whisking it, until it gets to a very soft peak. You can see it's just starting to thicken. I want to keep going until it just starts to hold these streaks. Now you can do this in the mixer, but the problem is the next item that we need to make is meringue. And if you do the egg whites in a fatty surface, then you will impede the whipping of the egg whites. So to avoid that at all, I just get a little exercise and mix this by hand. It really shouldn't take very long at all. You can see it's just starting to hold its shape. That's as far as I want to go. If you go any further, you're gonna get a really thick cream, and it's going to affect the texture of the mousse. It'll be very grainy in the end. So what I'm going to do is take this and put it in the refrigerator until I need it. So now we're going to make our meringue, and the two components here are room temperature egg whites and sugar. We do not add the sugar right away. So what we want to do is turn this on high. Now this is such a small amount that I'm going to have to kind of get my bowl up a little bit higher because I have a large 6-quart mixer. But if you have a smaller mixer, this should work a little easier. So the less egg white you have in your bowl, the higher the speed that you can put it. But if you have plenty of space in there, then you want a little bit lower speed to control that. So we're looking for it to get to a white foam before we add any sort of sugar. We do not want to weigh the meringue down. We want to aerate it as much as possible. So we'll let this go, and I'll show you at the stage where we start adding the sugar. So this is what it looks like. It is a white foam. I'll place this down so you can see it. That is not stiff, but you cannot see any of the yellow liquid through it. So this is where we want to start slowly adding our sugar in a gentle sprinkle motion. And this should take a couple minutes. And over time, this will actually get very glossy and it will get stiffer. So I'm about 2/3 of the way through. I have a little bit of sugar left, but it is getting much shinier. It's still not stiff yet because it needs to really incorporate some more air, but give it the time and you'll see the difference. All of the sugar's now been added, and I'm going to turn it up just to give it a little bit of a boost to get it to stiff heat. You'll really be able to see the difference visually. Of how your whisk makes it through the mixture, and this is what we're looking for. It's very glossy and it's not broken, and that's what you want. So working quickly, I want to finish off my ganache over here, and I have my warm chocolate and the coffee, and I'm going to add the butter. You can see it's extremely soft. And the residual warmth of that chocolate should melt that butter. I just kept it over warm water. You do not want any chunks of butter in this mousse because it will not work itself out anywhere else. And so nobody wants to bite into a big chunk of butter that's not dissolved. So you can see now it's thinning out because the butter is becoming a liquid. And we'll mix this until it's completely smooth. Add in the egg yolks and then mix it right into our egg whites here. So I want to remove all of our egg white mixture or meringue from here by beating it against the side. You can definitely do this in the mixer with the whisk attachment, but I like to do it here because I have a little bit more control over it, and my bowl is quite large, so it's hard to put all the chocolate in there without making a big mess. So I just want to keep mixing this. It's almost fully incorporated. If you find any little pieces on the side, just kind of smush them with your spatula, smear them into the edge, and it will create a nice homogeneous mixture. Almost there. Don't wait too long because then this will get very grainy and we have to work very quickly. That's why my cream is ready in the refrigerator when I need it. So it's very much like pastry cream where you have to have everything ready at the same time. All right, this looks beautiful. So now I'm going to add my egg yolks in. Stir this up till it's completely mixed together. Again, if that chocolate is too hot, you'll not only melt the butter too soon, but you'll actually cook the egg yolks, and you don't want to cook them. You just want them to be fully incorporated. All right, so now we grab our whisk and we place our egg whites here, and very gently, without knocking too much of the air out, you want to add in your chocolate mixture. So kind of gently and vigorously at the same time, which can be a complicated task for most people just getting used to pastry, when to be gentle and when to be firm. You want to mix this in, still maintaining that aeration. We do not want to deflate everything. So kind of scooping up to the bottom, but mixing it in quickly. Now remember, later on, what's going to actually set this mousse is the chocolate itself, because at room temperature, when it's warm, it's liquid, and when it's cool, it's solid. So that will actually set it. We don't need any gelatin in this. So we're gonna get the cream and add that now. My cream is gonna go in next. If I would have whipped it too much, when I keep folding, it's gonna keep making it thicker, and that's when you tend to get a grainy mousse. So right now I'm gonna add about half of it and fold it by turning the bowl and my spatula, scooping it from the bottom to the top over itself, being very gentle. I don't wanna stir it, and I don't wanna whisk this in. I wanna very gently incorporate that whipped cream. This should have very few streaks when we're, actually it has no streaks when we're finished with it, but we do not want to keep over whipping it. You will want this to set in the refrigerator for a little bit before you use it, unless you're going to put it right into cups for serving later on, but because we're using it to mold the cake, we want it to set just a little bit so it's not too runny. So keep scraping those sides, making sure that there are no streaks. So it'll almost look like a milk chocolate color when you are finished. So we're ready to assemble the cake, and here is my chocolate cake that has been actually in the refrigerator because I find that it's easier to assemble and cut when it's cold. So what I'm going to do is score the outside edges, lift it off of here, place another piece of parchment on top, and flip it out onto my cutting board. Go ahead and release the paper from the back side. Place it back on top and give it one more flip back over so the sticky side here will be easier to work with. So I'm going to take my ring, and actually I want to get 2 cuts out of this, and this is a little too small for 2 full cuts, but we're going to make this work. So I go right to the edge where I know that I will get 1 cut that will fit inside, and then I'm going to do the next one as close as possible with just having a slight amount that needs to be filled. So if you look to see here, I can create a circle and finish that off by just cutting that little piece, using the ring as our guide. What you end up with are 2 rounds. You have your base, and then I have my chocolate mousse that I need to assemble. I want to make sure that I don't waste all the excess chocolate that I cut around here. If you happen to be doing this in a sheet pan, you can just set one right on top of the other after you've cut it in half. But I'll go ahead and freeze that cake and use it for crumbles on something else, or lining it in a cup with some mousse itself or the pastry cream at a later date. So what I want to do now is I have my ring. I'm going to reassemble it back onto my feuilletine base. And I want to take a little bit of the chocolate mousse so it will stick the cake layer onto the base. And once it's refrigerated, it will not separate itself. Now, if you happen to have a acetate sheet, you want to go ahead and wrap this around the inside. That will be easier to remove later on. If you don't, you can just chill this really well and use the warmth of your hands to remove it. But I'm going to go ahead and line this, and then once you've spread out the first little layer of mousse to act like as glue to adhere the cake and the feuilletine layer, I'm going to place the cut piece of cake first in here to really hide that more on the bottom, and just set that inside nicely so it sits flush, and then add some more of my mousse on top and spread that out. Now if you wanted to add raspberry jam or some other sort of jam on top of there, you absolutely can as well. Keep in mind the height of your ring, that you don't want to go too high over the top. Some rings are taller than others. So again, I'm going to use the technique of turning my pan. There is no right or wrong of how many layers or how much you want to put in there. It's just a matter of the size of your pan that you have to make this work. So I'm going to try and make this as even as possible. And then I'm going to place the last cake layer on top, making sure that it all stays in one piece and really sits flush inside. So this will give me the opportunity now to take, not necessarily the rest of my mousse, because that will depend on the size of your cake that you're making, but enough mousse to go ahead and level off the top And if I happen to have extra when I unmold this, I can actually ice the sides a little bit, and that will give me a much smoother texture around the edge. So I'm trying not to deflate the mousse. If you leave the mousse in the refrigerator too long after you've made it, while you're trying to create the assembly, it will actually get very stiff and hard to spread. So you want to refrigerate it for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes max, until it just has a little bit more body to it, and you can spread it evenly, but you're not deflating any of that mousse. That's really important. Okay, so what I'm doing is just gently turning the pan to even this out. You can see how much easier it is to use a smaller offset versus a larger one. This will work right now in this stage, but when you have a smaller space, it is easier to move it around with the smaller. All right, so what I'm trying to do is get it as even on top, because eventually the glaze will go over this. And it's pretty much flush with the metal ring. That's pretty good to me. So I have a little bit of mousse left over from this batch that I'm gonna save to be able to ice the outside, so when I glaze it, it will be a smooth glaze throughout. So unfortunately at this stage, it's not ready to use. You do have to refrigerate it for quite a few hours, and you do want to have the ring remain intact. Do not lift it out until it is fully set and you're ready to glaze. After your cake is chilled overnight preferably, we're going to remove the ring. So if you need to, you can warm it up slightly, but I do have the acetate. So if you don't have the acetate, you really do want to warm it up with your hands, and then it should release itself from the mousse. This is just a really clean way of doing it. You're going to remove the acetate strip and get ready for glazing. So the next best thing before we glaze our mousse cake is to place it onto a cardboard circle. That will give it a lot more stability. So while your cake is cold right from the refrigerator, lift it up and place it right onto here. And now you can hold the bottom and not worry about getting your hands dirty or breaking the cake itself, because it does have that fragile base. So this is ready to be glazed at this point, or since I have a little leftover mousse from yesterday, I actually want to fill in the sides. You can see the layers here. I want to make it so that I do not see those layers. And I'm just going to place with my offset spatula some mousse on the outside of the cake. So you get a much smoother texture when we glaze it. So you can see how that looks right there. So I'm gonna go around the entire cake and smooth it out using my spatula, and then just smoothing the top edge. Once you've smoothed your cake, you can take your offset spatula in a little bit of hot water, wipe it off, and just smooth out that surface to get rid of any of those unwanted imperfections, and that will allow your glaze to sit a little bit smoother on top. So at this point, I'm going to chill this, and we're going to make our glaze for the top. The next step is for our chocolate glaze. So I have a bowl of my dark chocolate, and I have a bain-marie. So a pot of water, pot with just a small amount of water. I'm going to place this over. You do not want this to come to a boil. I have it on very low. I actually boil it first, then turn it down, just so it's much hotter to start with. And the chocolate should start to melt fairly quickly. So if you look at the bottom, you just keep stirring. Once it's been on there for a minute or so, the chocolate should start to melt. Now you could do this again in the microwave, but it's a little bit easier to control the glaze on top of the stove. As you can see, the chocolate's been sitting on the bowl for about a minute or so, and you can see it's beautifully melted. Please make sure you do not boil this water underneath. You don't want any of the steam coming up to seize this chocolate, because chocolate and water do not like each other necessarily. So we want to keep stirring, moving it around and letting the heat from the bowl that's being created from the bain-marie melt the chocolate. So this will take about another minute or so, and then we're ready to add our butter. So stir the chocolate vigorously the whole time so it evenly melts. And as soon as you don't see any more pieces of unmelted chocolate, go ahead and add the butter. And we want to stir this in. I'm actually going to turn my bain-marie off so it's just sitting on the heat. And we stir that butter in. That's going to give it a lot of body, a lot of shine, and a really wonderful flavor. Now, once your butter is completely melted, I have just a few more little pieces in there, then I'm ready to add my corn syrup and my Kahlua, or my coffee liqueur. If you don't want to use any liqueur, then you can make a simple syrup and add that to it. Maybe a coffee flavored simple syrup would be fantastic in this. You just need the little bit of residual sugar that is in the liqueur to be able to help create the body and the shine of this instead of just adding more water or liquid. So you could simulate the liqueur by doing a simple syrup. So I'm going to add my corn syrup. That will help give it, again, a nice sheen and pliability to my glaze so it won't get hard and crack on the top of my cake. And then we have our coffee liqueur for flavor. Stir this up and your glaze is ready to go. The last part of putting this cake together is to make sure that we put the glaze on properly. So if your glaze is too hot, it's going to melt your mousse, and we don't want that. So we want to take a temperature of the glaze, and we're just about 100 degrees right now, which is perfect. A little bit less is fine. Too much more than that and it's going to be too hot. So what we want to do is then make sure that we have all the right tools at our disposal. You will need your large offset spatula, and you will need your glazing rack with parchment underneath. And the reason why we put the parchment underneath is so that it will catch any of our glaze. It's easier to remove, and then you can reuse the glaze over and over just by warming it up and then using it. So you can keep that in the refrigerator or the freezer. What I want to do is pour this directly in the center and then in a circular motion. Don't be afraid to use more than you think you need, because again, we are going to have excess. So we want to take our spatula and very gently go over and over, making sure that it glazes the sides as well without digging the top too much into the mousse. We do not want to see any streaking. That's all you want to do. One this way, and then turn your cake. Give it a little tap to help gravity do some of the work for you, and let it set. If your mousse is frozen, this will set too soon and it will be very difficult to work with. So we want to let this just set right now for a few minutes and then finish it off in the refrigerator. So if your glaze was too cold, this would be very mottled and you would actually see the streaking in there. That's why we need the perfect temperature so that you don't start to see any of the imperfections. It just lays very flat. If you're interested in decorating the sides of the cake, you want to change out your paper on the bottom. And I just took the little Jimmy sprinkles and I coated them with a copper color to make it a little more sophisticated. Placing my hand up underneath onto the cardboard, and then with my hands just dipping the sides while it's still wet into the colored jimmies. Now you can go all the way up the sides, or you can just do the bottom edge. Your choice, turning the cake as you do it. And then it just decorates the bottom edge and makes it look more finished off, like this. Now for the best part is cutting the cake and getting to eat it, obviously. So whenever you're removing your cake from your glazing rack, you always want to use your offset spatula, get up under the cardboard, put your hand underneath, lift up, and then remove. So we're going to place this directly onto the cutting board, and you're going to do the same thing. Spatula underneath, remove your hand, and then let it down. That's the easiest and safest way to protect the outside edge. One of the most important steps is to make sure that you have a hot knife to cut through the chocolate. So what I like to do is take hot water, run my knife under the hot water. You can also use a torch to do this, but the hot water works really well. And then please make sure that you wipe off the knife so you don't have any water on here. Try and find a knife long enough to cut all the way through and let the knife do the work. And the warmth should cut right through beautifully onto there. Now remember, you have that crunchy bottom, so make sure you go through the bottom and then out the side. Do not lift up out of the cake, otherwise you're going to have a mousse line and it's very unattractive. So every single time you make a cut, make sure that you heat your knife in the hot water, wipe it off, and then go across. So I'm just going to cut one piece out of here so that you can see. Make sure you crunch through and then out the side. Take your offset spatula, get up underneath, and then you can remove your slice of cake. Beautiful. Enjoy!